Good morning, everyone. I'm Rakshita Disanayaka. On behalf of Ananda College All Boys Association of West Coast, in collaboration with East Coast, and President of all the All Boys and All Girls Alumni Associations, I would like to welcome all of you to our 5th virtual Zoom presentation and discussion. Going back in time, I would like to thank our members, Mr. Pradeep Gunaratna, and Colonel Lucky Rajasinghe for pioneering this idea of Zoom meetings. So far, we had 4 successful Zoom events. This time, we are diverting the forum from the medical aspect of saving lives to economic and financial aspect affecting our livelihoods by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to thank Nalin Kulasurya for initiating the economic aspect to this Zoom presentation series and coordinating this event. This event is the work of youngsters of the organization, and I'm happy to see them blossoming in their leadership roles under the guidance of our senior members. My sincere thanks to the guest speakers, world-renowned economic forecaster, Mr. Ian Shepherdson, and Chairman of the Signature Bank, Mr. Scott Shea. Further, my deepest appreciation to Signature Bank for sponsoring this event. Finally, my gratitude goes to Rahim Mantara, Colonel Lucky Rajasinghe, and Tilanjan Vidana, together with Acobawc Planning and Execution Committee and Oregon State University team for their tireless commitment in organizing this event. Also to Sri Lanka Foundation for their support in publishing our event in their community newsletter. Now, I would like to introduce the moderator for today, Dr. Shama Janaka Mahakalanda. He's another young talent of Ananda College, physician in Sri Lanka with a master's in economics and just completing his PhD in health policy at Oregon State University. He also a talented musician and an artist. Here is Janaka to lead the presentation and discussion. Thank you.
Greetings to all present at this event. We are navigating through unprecedented times. In the history of our world, we have had a few pandemics. Some of them literally decimated our populations. One may wonder how a virus such as COVID-19 that has relatively low mortality could cripple our economies, limit our mobility, and put the entire world under quarantine. Let's put this in context, ladies and gentlemen. The last known pandemic, the Spanish flu, was before we had established coordinated healthcare and antibiotics. Let's compare that to where we are today. Today we boast of full spectrum antibiotics, wide variety of antivirals, best ever digital infrastructure that brags about 5G, and well-established, highly accessible healthcare infrastructure. But this virus has crippled us. In our last session, we discussed the clinical impact of COVID-19. Dr. Rasi Wickramasinghe said, most viruses attack a system and does that pretty well. But COVID-19 attacks all systems and does that very, very well. What is more important today is to note that in this digital age, there's no real answer in sight, not much promise in the horizon either. That makes COVID-19 probably one of the most dangerous pandemics of our times. Health experts have also suggested that this could be the beginning of this norm where we live with such pandemics. Many countries are worried about a second wave or a recurrence. Today, we need to learn how to be economically productive and sustain our livelihoods in the presence of such inclement threats to our lives in the future. Today, we are honored and privileged to present to you 2 gentlemen who have reached the pinnacle of eminence in their respective fields. Before I introduce these eminent personalities, I would like to inform you and bring to your attention some of the housekeeping matters. Your Zoom will stay mute for the remainder of this session. However, we would like to hear your questions and we would like to pass them on to the panel. Please use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and please type in your question. When time permits, we will ask them I cannot promise I will ask them all, but I will try. Before I introduce, please, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome Mr. Scott Shea. Scott's career spans Wall Street, private equity, venture capital, and banking. Ladies and gentlemen, very few people can match up to his knowledge and experience in these fields. His contribution in the field of banking is very well known, and his reputation as an innovative banker precedes him. He is a provocative commentator on many financial issues, banking system, society, cashless world, which we are going to ask him about, and tax reforms. His speeches are absolutely riveting and thought-provoking. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in for a treat, I'll promise you that. He has served at multiple top management levels and board positions in various organizations and has done that very successfully. He co-founded the Signature Bank. He became the inaugural chairman, and to date he serves at that capacity. In addition to Signature Bank, he is also the chairman of the Signature Group while serving as a sitting board member. Ladies and gentlemen, he has also authored some best-selling books, such as Getting Our Groove Back, How to Energize American Jewry, and In Good Faith. Mr. Shea, we are absolutely privileged to have you here with us. I fail in my duty if I don't mention the kind of support Signature Bank has extended to us in organizing this event. Thank you very much, Signature Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to invite Mr. Scott Shea to address you, and then he will introduce our resource person, Dr. Ian Shepherdson. Scott, the stage is yours.
Two co-founders, Joe DiPaolo and John Tamberlane, and we met in a room, probably not a lot bigger than the rooms any of you were sitting in, 5 of us, and we started, or 6 of us, and we started the bank from scratch. We started with $42.5 million in capital, and today we are a bank in excess of $50 billion that has grown entirely by bringing in new clients. We've never done an acquisition. And so it's not like someone was a part of one bank and then we acquired that bank. We've never, ever done an acquisition. Everybody who's come into Signature Bank has done so because they want to, because they have a relationship manager or they have someone or some reason to come into the bank. And the big secret to our success has been that we put service and safety first. So during 2008, and I think this is some of the questions that I was sent to actually anticipate this a little bit, but I want to say one thing first, which is that people ask us, well, what happened in 2008? Well, in 2008, we actually were the only bank in the United States with more than $4 billion in assets that never had a down year in profitability. We made more money in 2008 than 2007, more money in 2009 than 2008, et cetera, all the way through the crisis. And the reason we did it is because the first thing I think of and that we think of when we wake up in the morning until our head hits the pillow at night is depositor safety. And it's at a time like this that really, really needs to be at a premium. Putting the depositor first, putting folks' money first. And when you live in we live in a very strange time right now on a whole host of levels, with the pandemic, societally, economically, that being safe and sound, making sure that people can sleep at night with where their money is really our central siren song. So we have been working since this crisis happened, and I know I speak for most of my colleagues at Signature Bank. I mean, we have been working 24/7, or in my case, 24/6. I do take one day off. Just working with clients, and that's what sort of this time is all about. And and we'll get into this, I'm sure, later. But I've spoken frequently to people within the Fed, in the administration, in the state, in our at least New York state government, in other state governments, about what can be done economically, what needs to be done, what problems people are facing, what problems businesses are facing. So I'm looking forward to getting involved in all of those issues through the Q&A and in discussion with Ian. So it's really a privilege to introduce and to join Ian Shepherdson to this event. Ian has been our counselor and economist almost since the inception of Signature Bank. We started working with Ian even before he founded Pantheon. And as soon as he did, I think Ian will remember, as soon as he founded Pantheon, I called him and I said, we want to be your first client. And since then we have been, because we really trust Ian, not only for he has been our counselor and economist almost since the inception of Signature Bank. We started working with Ian even before he founded Pantheon. And as soon as he did, I think Ian will remember, as soon as he founded Pantheon, I called him and I said, we want to be your first client. And since then we have been, because we really trust Ian, not only for his economic forecasts, which are often eerily correct, but as well, and this is what's needed at a time like this, as well as to understand the factors that go into that forecast. Because right now there are so many, and for the last years, there have been so many wild cards, geopolitical and others, that mean that one isn't always going to be correct. But it is important to understand all of the phenomena behind what is going on. And with that sort of deeper understanding, you can place your own weighting on where you think things are going to happen and what to do next. And Ian has received really a lot of accolades. And I think some of them are listed on the flyer. But I also think this, and I think this really helps Ian to understand, and I think that historically, the people that understand any phenomena the most are folks who can look at it a bit from the outside. I think all of our ancient texts show that the people who end up speaking truth end up being people who are a little bit outside of society, at the margins of society. I'm not saying in any kind of negative way, but aren't necessarily part of the inner group. And I think the fact that Ian is located somewhat, 4,000 miles away, but yet is one of the preeminent experts on the U.S. economy, I think is no coincidence. I think Ian really has the ability to look at what we're doing over here on this side of the pond with perhaps a bit of additional objectivity and insight, because he can zoom out to see the bigger picture and to see what's going on here. So when we were approached about doing this seminar at Signature Bank, really the first thought I had was to call Ian and ask him if he would join, and which he has so graciously agreed to do. So with that, I think what I would do is pass the baton to Ian, and I think you might be able to give us some insight into what you're currently thinking. I know you're planning a big event, you're planning a big event tomorrow, so you've been doing some thinking over the weekend, I'm sure. And I'm wondering if you can give us some tops of the waves on your current thinking, and then we can get into much more detail.
Thank you very much, Scott. That was a fantastic introduction, and we are very excited to have Ian with us today. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present Ian Shepherdson to address you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Scott, for your very kind introduction. I'm blushing here, but as I'm 7,000 miles away, you can't see. Oh, you can see. That's technology for you. This is the most confusing, the most difficult, the most uncertain, and the fastest moving macroeconomic environment I can remember. And I've been doing this now. This is my 30th year doing this. So this is a very, very strange situation to be in, where for most economists, you know, when we tell our economic stories, we tend to have a bunch of indicators, we string them all together, we construct a narrative around those numbers, and then we put a forecast on the end of it that's consistent with what we're seeing. That doesn't work now. All the indicators that I would normally show you, in fact, if we'd done this meeting 6 months ago, it's what I would have done. I would have started with 20 or 30 different macroeconomic indicators and built a story around them. And I'm not going to show you any of those numbers because there's no point, because the economy is moving faster than the data can capture, certainly faster than the data are released. We've had to look for new things, some sort of almost real-time indicators to tell us what might be happening in the economy. Some of these data didn't even exist before COVID, and they've started to be produced since the crisis. But really, I think rather than diving straight into the economic numbers, what I'd like to do is kind of give you a sort of a three-part framework that you can use, you know, keep in the back of your head when you're thinking about what's going to happen next. And when you're trying to assimilate this enormous wave of data that we get every day, all these headlines that the media are full of, both national and local and international, every single day, it's kind of overwhelming trying to work out, you know, where we actually are and what's happening. But I think there's some, from my perspective, there's three things that are really important. There's three questions you've got to ask yourself when you're thinking about, well, how can we get out of this? When will we get out of this? What will the economy look like by the end of it? And the three things that you need to think about, firstly, are the progress with the virus itself. Because until the virus is beaten or gone or vaccinated out of existence, we can't have a full recovery. So that is the first point, that there is no going back to 100% of our previous economy as long as the COVID is circulating through the population, putting people in the hospital, killing vulnerable people, and causing the rest of us to constrain our activity. So we cannot normalize until we've made that progress and contained it or defeated it. The second thing we need to think about is what the Federal Reserve is doing on the monetary policy front in terms of providing support through interest rates, through its balance sheet, through its lending programs. And I'll give you a sneak preview that from a macro perspective, things are going pretty well on that front. I don't have many criticisms of the Fed. And the third thing to think about is what the federal government is doing, because the federal government has the fiscal firepower, which the Fed doesn't have directly. But the actions of the Fed and the federal government are very much joined at the hip, because the Fed effectively is financing a lot of the federal government's extraordinary actions, of which there's more to come. So they're the three pillars of the story. And let me just maybe give you some pictures and show you where we are. So I'm now going to attempt to share my screen, and fingers crossed you'll see some charts very soon. And that would be where are we? Technology, eh? Let's try this.
And while you're doing that, I'm just going to point out that we've had a lot of conversations with the Fed and with the Treasury, and unusually, the Fed is all ears. I mean, if you have a good idea, they're willing to listen.
And we are going to talk about that, Scott. We are going to talk a lot about that later.
Okay,
yes,
so are you now seeing the chart book with the
yes, we are.
Excellent, great. Okay, so let me show you where we are now. What is going on in the US? So unfortunately, the title gives the game away. The second wave is bigger than the first. So what do I mean? I mean the number of cases is now running at about 37,000 new cases per day. That's confirmed cases with the PCR test. And the previous peak back in early April was just over 30,000. So there's a first wave, there's a decline for a couple of months, and then we have the second wave, for a really dramatic acceleration. It's almost as steep as the first wave. Of course, this doesn't capture all the cases. The CDC now believes that there are 10 times as many unrecorded cases as there are recorded cases in the US. But the point is that the rate of change of the confirmed case numbers has rocketed. It is not a story about testing. So testing has gone up. We're now doing about 550,000 tests a day. And if you go back to April, we were doing 140,000 tests a day. So that's great. They've gone up by 400,000 tests per day. And during the first phase of that acceleration in testing, the proportion of positive tests was going down, and that was great. But it bottomed out in about mid-June, and now it's rising quite strongly. And some states now have got substantial double-digit positive test rates. Texas is 15, 17%, Arizona is similar. And it's rising in a very broad range of southern and western states. So as a consequence of the increase in testing, why do we care about people catching COVID? Well, we care about it because it puts a significant proportion of people in the hospital and makes them very sick, and some of them it kills. There are millions of asymptomatic people, but that doesn't matter when you've got enough people becoming sick enough to require hospitalization to the point where the hospital system becomes overwhelmed. So right now, you can see that the new cases, the black line, just lag the hospitalizations lag the case numbers. The hospitalizations are the black line, and hospitalizations are beginning to increase. Over the last week, we've seen an unambiguous upturn in the number of people being hospitalized, and it will go up further. The good news is that the new cases seem to be skewing a lot younger. So the median person in Florida being confirmed with COVID now is about 35 years old. And back in March, they were 65 years old. So the share of people requiring hospitalization is much higher for older people. So I don't expect that hospitalization line to rise as dramatically as it did back in the spring. But it is going up quite quickly in some states, and it's already putting strain on the healthcare systems, particularly in Florida, Texas, and Arizona. It will kill more people as well. Deaths like hospitalizations. Again, the death rate has been falling relative to the hospitalizations, and I think that'll probably continue because hospitals are getting better at treating people. The steroid treatment, can't remember the name of it, that came out of the UK study a couple of weeks ago, seems to reduce death rates by about a third in the most sick patients. So there are very good reasons for thinking that we'll not see as many deaths relative to hospitalizations, but I don't know where hospitalizations are going to peak because I don't know where cases are going to peak. And right now, there's no sign that the second wave is peaking. So let's have a look at the heart of it. So Florida, Texas, California, Arizona. Arizona is the worst. These numbers are all new cases per million of population. So these numbers are directly comparable. And Arizona about 400 new cases per million, Florida 300, Texas 200, California about 140, but all rising. I've marked Memorial Day on the chart. Was it people's behavior over Memorial Day that caused this sort of sudden acceleration? Because the trends before Memorial Day were clearly flat. I don't know. It may well be that it's simply the lagged effect of the reopening in many states, and the Memorial Day is nothing more than a coincidence. But anyway, over the last month, we've gone from a flat trend in the South and the West to an unambiguous acceleration. And while the Arizona rate of increase might be leveling off, the Florida rate of increase isn't, Texas isn't, California isn't as well. So, and there's another 25 states where cases are increasing. And actually, it's not all in the South and the West. Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, bit of an uptick as well. Notice that the numbers, again, cases per million are much lower than the South and the West, but the acceleration in Ohio is pretty dramatic. So it is mostly the South and the West, but it's not only there. However, if you look at the Northeast and some other Midwest states, there is no uptick. There is no uptick. I guess what's happened here is that these states have reopened much more slowly. The populations have been much more traumatized because they had such horrendous COVID outbreaks in the spring. So people are social distancing, they're wearing masks. they're behaving a lot more carefully and cautiously than people in the South who didn't get the first wave and therefore seemed to think that maybe it wasn't going to happen to them. Well, you know, now it clearly is. So this all sounds, you know, gloom and doom, but there is something that's slightly positive. So hospitalizations are rising on chart 8, but let's look at the scale. So this is hospitalizations per million people. Arizona is the worst state at about 300. At the peak in April in New York, hospitalizations were 950 per million. So Arizona is only a third as bad as New York was at the peak. Now, I've got to say, you know, just having a policy objective of not being as bad as New York isn't very ambitious, because the situation in New York was hideous. But it does mean that there is still time for policymakers to take actions that prevent these southern states and western states being as bad as New York. And there's time for people to change their behavior to stop things being as bad as it was in New York as well. And of course, the population in New York is older than in most of these states, apart from Florida. And of course, the population density in New York is much, much higher. So, you know, number of people per square mile in New York is 8 times higher than Houston. It's 20-something times higher than Charleston, South Carolina. You know, it's a very densely populated place. And so I think that the chances are that the southern and western outbreaks will not become as bad as they were in New York in the spring. I mean, that really is the key takeaway here, that it's unlikely that they'll become as bad, partly because of the geography and the demographics, and partly because people's behavior is already starting to change in response to the rise in cases. So I can't be positive about the current state of the first pillar of my 3-pillar story. The virus part of the story is a drag on the economy still. The drag is diminishing in the Northeast because those states are still reopening, but unfortunately it's beginning to reconstrain the states of the South and the West, which had been opening earlier. You know, Texas began to open in early May, so did Tennessee and Georgia and South Carolina. And so in all of those states which began to reopen, we saw a clear acceleration in the economic indicators. And I'll come to that, but they're now pulling back again, even as the Northeast reopens. So instead of having what I was hoping for, which was a broad improvement across the whole country, we're now getting a very mixed picture where the Northeast states are going to get better and the South and the West is going to get worse. And that's roughly a 60-40 split in terms of contribution to GDP. Now, the Northeast is very densely populated and very rich. A lot of the southern states that have got big problems, like Mississippi and Alabama, Louisiana, you know, these are not wealthy places and they're not big populous states. But nonetheless, unfortunately, the idea of a straight line recovery across the whole country, which I think is what everybody was hoping for 6 weeks ago, that's not going to happen. It can't happen now. We are now moving back into a period of restriction in the South and the West. Now, some of that restriction will be imposed by policy. They closed the bars in Texas on Friday. Some of it will be restrictions that people impose upon themselves by just not going out as much. But the combination of the two things, autonomous action and policy action, is going to slow the recovery in the South and the West and maybe even put it into reverse for a while. And that really wasn't what we were all looking for when we were all the economists talking about a second half rebound. I still think the economy will be better in the third quarter than the second, but that's a very, very low bar because the second quarter was completely hammered by the March and April catastrophe. So it's a very mixed story, and I cannot be as positive as I'd like to be on that first pillar of the economic picture. The second pillar of the economic picture is the Fed, and here I can be positive. The Fed moved very quickly, very aggressively. They cut interest rates to 0. They didn't even wait for the scheduled meetings, they just did it. They stepped into markets and intervened to prevent markets becoming disorderly. This is a lesson of 2008 that's been learned and applied very quickly. And they've told markets effectively, if you want to take us on, good luck. We have an infinite balance sheet and you lose. And as a result of that very credible promise to do whatever is necessary to keep markets smooth and orderly, markets have remained smooth and orderly. This is the paradox of prevention, as I believe epidemiologists call it, where you take action to prevent the bad thing, and the bad thing doesn't happen, and then people say, well, why did you take the action? Well, the answer is, if we hadn't taken the action, the bad thing would have happened. So a lot of the things that the Fed has offered to do, they haven't actually had to do because markets have realized that taking on the Fed is a losing proposition. The other thing the Fed has done, hugely importantly, is that the Fed has provided a lot of the money required by the federal government to implement its rescue packages, of which the CARES Act is the biggest, but there are others and there's more to come. So just to give you the big picture, without COVID, this year the US would have borrowed about $1 trillion, so slightly less than 5% of GDP, which is a lot, but it's not unsustainable in the short term. Borrowing now with COVID this year is likely to be of the order of $5 to $6 trillion against a GDP of $22 trillion. So this is really very substantial. This is Second World War style borrowing levels, but it's not unique to the US, by the way. I mean, there are other countries doing similar things, but it is enormous. And the money's had to be borrowed very quickly because the virus struck very quickly and the rescue package have had to be implemented very rapidly. So under normal circumstances, for the Treasury to put its hand up in the markets and say, you know, we need to borrow $5 or $6 trillion would be very difficult. And it would have resulted almost certainly in a big increase in government borrowing costs, which then would have fed into the rest of the economy. Because when government borrowing costs rise, your borrowing costs rise as well. And so this had to be prevented. So the Fed has, effectively what the Fed has done is has said to the Treasury, okay, you issue this new debt and we'll buy most of it. So that's what's happened. And that is, when we hear about quantitative easing, QE, or money printing, these are all the same things. This is the Fed buying up the government debt rather than the Treasury being forced to find buyers in the private market. So when the Fed does this, the Fed's own balance sheet expands because they're effectively printing money out of thin air, because this is what central banks can do, and using that money to buy the government's debt. And the government uses the proceeds to pay for the enhanced unemployment benefits and to provide support for state and local government and to provide the financing for the Main Street Lending Program and the Payroll Protection Program and all these things. So the result is that the Fed's balance sheet, which is the blue line, has risen vertically. I put the S&P 500, the stock market, on the same chart just because during the post-crash period in 2008, it tracked the Fed's balance sheet very closely. And then the market ran ahead of itself. And now they're kind of moving back together somewhat. The Fed's balance sheet will keep expanding. My guess is that by the end of the year, I probably have to redraw that chart with a higher number on the left-hand axis. I think its balance sheet might get up to $10 trillion. Nobody would have imagined this 6 months ago. And under normal circumstances, this would not happen. This is, to be very clear, this is super extraordinary policy because we face super extraordinary circumstances. And what happens when the Fed prints a lot of money? It's creating money out of nothing, so the money supply goes up. And the money supply has gone up in the last 3 months faster than any time since we started counting the numbers back in the 50s. So this is really quite a surprising looking chart. This is the money supply. It's called M2 technicality. The rate of increase over the last 3 months, annualized 83%. And there's the entire history of the data back to the 50s. Never been anything like this. This is why the stock market's done so well. No one's been buying the stock market because the earnings outlook is great. People have been buying the stock market because there's so much money floating around that it's got to go somewhere. It doesn't mean the market goes up every day. It went down Friday, and I'm very nervous about tomorrow. But fundamentally, the Fed's support for the market is kind of not their prime objective of policy. Their prime objective of policy has been to print the money for the government to spend to support the economy. But as a kind of unavoidable side effect, they've flooded the markets with liquidity, with cash, and so the stock market has been supported. This support is not going to go away. Whether it's enough to offset the second wave of COVID, I don't know. But this is the biggest single reason why the stock market has done so well against what has been, from an economic perspective, an absolute catastrophe. So what's the federal government done with the money? Well, it's paid a lot of unemployment benefits. So the blue line on this chart is wages, which normally just trend up very, very gently. So they dropped because so many people lost their jobs. But the black line is government transfers to households, and they have gone up by more than wages have dropped. So actually, across the country as a whole, a lot of people are better off being unemployed because of the enhanced unemployment benefits, $600 a week extra to everybody. So actually, the finances of individuals net at the moment are okay. But of course, remember, as of now, the enhanced unemployment benefits are scheduled to end at the end of July. I don't think that will happen. I think they'll extend them. The House has already passed a bill to extend them, another $3 trillion on top of the $3 trillion that's been spent already. That bill is sitting in the Senate, which will not pass $3 trillion, but I think it'll probably agree to about 1.5. So we've got a lot more stimulus coming to prevent the households, you, me, everybody else, falling off a cliff financially at the end of July, because that would be a disaster. And it can't happen with an election 4 months away. The Republicans in the Senate cannot refuse to do anything else. Why do they need to do more? Well, because the economy is now not as strong as we hoped it would be. How do we know? Because the data that we got now is like April or May. I mean, this is ancient history. It's July next week, and things are moving very quickly. But we do now have quite a lot of daily information about the economy. So here's something that's new. This is the number of people eating at restaurants on a daily basis compared to a year ago. And you can see across the whole of the US, the trend is still rising, just. But across the South, and I put California as well, which is not yet falling, but it probably will be soon. But look at Florida, Texas, Arizona, having risen very sharply when they began to reopen in late April, early May. The number of people eating out at restaurants is now going down again. Now, this is not because restaurants have been closed. This is because people are voting with their own fears, and they're saying it's too risky. So they're not going to do it. But this is a direct hit to the economy. And this will get worse. These numbers are going to go down substantially further because the headlines are worse every single day. Florida has just put out its latest numbers right now. The number of people in the ICU in Miami is up by 10% in one day. So, this is the sort of thing that makes people scared, and it makes them stay home. They are staying home. This is data from Apple. So Apple Mobility, again, daily information, which they never published before, but they started publishing it during the COVID crisis. And you can see there that, again, recovering, hitting bottom in April, recovering strongly. And then Houston, Miami, Phoenix, LA, flat or falling. New York, different story in the Northeast, where COVID is still under downward pressure and the state is reopening, rising. But the South and the West is going down. Now, there's only one consequence of this. If people are going out less, they're driving less, they're taking part in fewer leisure activities, they're spending less in restaurants. In Texas, they can't go to bars anymore. What happens? Jobs go. Jobs go. And we know this because we get daily information on jobs as well, something else we've never had before. So Homebase, which is a cloud platform for small employers, for scheduling, timesheets, and time management for small businesses right across the country. They publish data on every state day by day. And again, same story, recovery in May and early June, flattening off and now going down again. So, this is a clear downshift. Now, on Friday, this coming Friday, we're going to get official payroll numbers for June, which will be positive. But that's because the survey was taken in early June. And, in early June, the trend was still rising. The July numbers, I'm really worried that we might see payroll stalling. And I got to tell you, this was on nobody's agenda a month ago. Everybody was just getting out their ruler and drawing a straight line and saying it's just going to get better and better and better. And by the end of the summer, everything will be fine. You can't think that now, I'm afraid. We have to expect a longer period until the changes of behavior and the change of policy in the southern and western states brings the COVID incidence back down again and allows them to, well, I guess we have to call it reopen. But they'll be reopening a lot more carefully and a lot more cautiously. And that means that economic activity is not going to get back to anything like where it was in February, anything like that until the end of the year, really at the earliest, and realistically, until we got a vaccine. There's two exceptions to this, two exceptions, housing and cars. So the blue line on this chart is Google searches for the top 5 selling US autos, which, as you can see, dropped very sharply, but has fully recovered. And the black line is the number of mortgage applications for a home purchase, which again fell very sharply and has more than fully recovered. Now, this may sound very strange, how can we lose 25 million jobs and yet have more demand for cars than we had in February and more demand for houses than we had in February? Well, the answer probably is that most people who buy new cars and most people who buy homes are much older than the people who lost jobs in bars and restaurants. Where the median age of someone working in a bar is 29, the median age of a home buyer is 47, the median age of a new car buyer is 53. So we've got a massive disconnect in the auto market and the housing market between the people who lost their jobs and the people in these markets who are looking at interest rates falling and saying, great. So housing and autos are the standout sectors of the economy. They'll continue to improve even as the retail, the leisure, the hospitality, those sectors continue to struggle. So, but again, to come back to the point, the federal government is going to have to do more. I think there'll be another package passed by, well, the end of July, hopefully, but Congress is on, the Senate is on recess for July 4th, and they don't come back till the 20th. And these benefits run out on the 31st. So it's a very short window. We might have a period where benefits drop and then get reinstated, but they will do more. And ultimately, especially because it's an election year, I'm expecting the federal government to do enough to keep the economy ticking over until there's a vaccine. So this really is the most important thing now. There's more than 100 vaccines currently under testing. The first plausible candidate is from the Oxford Vaccine Group, stage 3 trials now. I mean, that potentially could be announced in September as successful. AstraZeneca has been manufacturing it for the last couple of months, funded by the US and UK governments. So they say they'd have 300 million doses available in October. Let's say that happens, and by Christmas, we're all vaccinated, so we start the new year, feeling safe and secure. Well, how long does it take for the economy to normalize after that? Probably another 6 months, maybe something like that. So a year from now, I think realistically is my target date, best case scenario for things being back to normal, apart from housing and cars. Housing, we're going to see a flight to the suburbs from the densely populated cities. For younger people with families, they don't want another lockdown in an apartment with screaming kids. And also for the auto market, because it's very clear that public transportation is a vector of transmission. No question about that. And so I would expect to see more people commuting by car and much less willingness to take public transportation. So I think the auto and the housing markets will be solid no matter what, but everything else I think is going to struggle. Even in states that are reopening successfully in the Northeast, which I think will be like Europe, the European reopening has gone pretty well. But even in those states, restaurants are going to have to run at 50% capacity. Movie theaters will be half empty. Gyms, music venues, sporting events, all of this stuff is going to be very capacity constrained. And bearing in mind that consumer spending on discretionary activity is the biggest single part of the economy. If those activities are constrained, it's not possible for the economy to normalize. It's just not possible. So against that background, the federal government, I think, has no choice but to provide more support. And to preempt, I think what will inevitably be the question of can we afford to do it? Well, yes, up to a point we can afford to do it. And there's a couple of ways of looking at this. The first is to say, well, look, if we don't do this, the economy will be a wasteland, and it will take it decades to recover. If it's just allowed to collapse without government support, it will be a catastrophe of an unimaginable magnitude. It will generate societal breakdown. It doesn't bear thinking about, but you don't need to think about it because it won't happen. The other way of thinking about it is, well, this money has to be borrowed. Well, right now, the market is saying to the US and to every other government in the developed world, please borrow as much as you like to do whatever it takes. So the US government can borrow for 10 years now at 0.7%. Inflation is 1.5%, which means that the real cost of public borrowing in the US is negative. The market is actually paying the US government to borrow money to fix the economy. This is not the 70s and 80s when 10-year money was double-digit costs. This is a different planet. This is a world where there is a huge excess of private sector savings that's got nowhere to go. It's a world with very, very low inflation. US inflation has dropped sharply, as the chart shows there. It's a world where markets are very happy to supply the capital that's needed. And of course, the central bank is providing over the last 3 months more than half of the money that's been needed. I fully accept that under normal circumstances, if the central bank just prints money endlessly, you'll end up with inflation. And this is a story of the Weimar Republic. This is a story of Zimbabwe in the 1990s, endless central bank financing. But I have to stress that we're a million miles away from that now, because this is it's a specific policy response to a specific set of circumstances. The scale of the central bank money printing in Europe and in the US right now is nothing. It's trivial compared to what happened in Germany and Weimar. So it's a question of scale, and it's a question of sustainability. The US ran budget deficits similar to today's numbers for 3 years at the end of the Second World War. And the public debt ratio rocketed. And yet the 20 years from 1945 to 1965 were the best 20 years for the US economy in history. Now, I'm not saying the next 20 years are going to be the best in history, but I am saying that simply having a high public debt ratio and a high budget deficit does not, in and of itself, mean that you have to worry. Now, what would worry me would be if we never find a vaccine for COVID and we never find effective therapies, because then the current hit to the economy will persist for several years until 70% of us have had it, 80% of us have had it, and we've got herd immunity. And during that time, the federal government would have to support the economy for a very extended period. Whether we could afford to do that at the current run rate, I don't know. But that is not my base case, because we've got 100 vaccines under testing. One of them's going to work. And so I am not losing any sleep over the budget deficit, over the financing, and over the ability of the federal government to do what it has to do to provide us with the support that we need while we wait for the vaccine. So I will wrap up because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So just to give you the key points, the crisis is real, it's ongoing. Yes, it's probably true that the latest spike in cases won't lead to as many hospitalizations and as many deaths as the previous one, because it's skewing younger, the treatment is better, we have drugs that save the sickest people, we've learned a lot in hospitals. But because so few people have had it, the disease still has the capacity to run rampant, and that means that we have to return to restrictions and controls, which is a direct hit to the economy. So while that's happening, while we see this retreat in the South and retreat in the West, we're going to have more action from the federal government, but that's okay because we can afford it. The restrictions ought to bear fruit, I think, by maybe the end of July. From New York locking down, in mid-March, there was an unambiguous improvement by mid-April. Things were still bad, but they were improving dramatically. So I'm hoping that by the end of July, we'll see a clear improvement in the South and the West. So we've got to grit our teeth for the next few weeks, but it will get better. We know that mask wearing works. We know that staying off public transportation works. We know that closing down bars and restaurants and nightclubs, we know that it works. But the reopening after that will have to be more cautious, because we also know that reopening recklessly doesn't work. From the perspective of the markets, inflation is low. This is a disinflationary event. I'm not worried that the Fed's money printing is going to cause rampant inflation. That's a second or third order question that we can address in 2021 or 2022. Right now, all you need to know is that inflation is down, not up, and that the Fed will be at zero for the foreseeable future, because really they have no other choice. They will be providing as much support as they can. The Fed has been very, very clear about this. They'll do whatever it takes. And when Fed Chair Powell was asked about Fed policy at the last FOMC meeting, he said, we're not even thinking about higher interest rates. So we're in this zero rate environment for the foreseeable future, because the Fed absolutely has to do what it needs to do to maintain the support for the economy. So I'll wrap up there. I'm very happy to take questions. There's a million things that I haven't talked about, and a lot that I have talked about. I'm very happy to go wherever you would like to go. So fire away. Thank
you very much, Ian. That was a fantastic introduction to our whole discussion, and you set the stage beautifully. Thank you very much. Well, I've been keeping an eye on the questions that we've been getting from the viewers, so I'll have to ask you this question, though you quite nicely elaborated what's going to happen in the near future. So a lot of news, contradicting or confusing news coming out, saying that we have an impending economic depression. Is it, why are they so scared, or is it even going to happen?
Yeah. So the difference between a recession and a depression. A recession in the US typically lasts for about 9 months. The recession after the crash of 2008 was exceptional. It lasted more than 18 months. But typically they last 9 months, three or 4 quarters. And within a year or so after that, you're kind of back to where you were before. A depression is much longer, much deeper, and the recovery takes much longer. So instead of getting the V shape, which is the sort of standard recovery from a regular recession, the recovery from a depression tends to be more of a Nike swoosh, where you get the steep fall and then the shallow, follow the finger, the shallow recovery. Now what that means is that the unemployment rate goes up and then only declines very slowly. And so you can have a very high unemployment rate for a very long time. And that's what's so scary about depressions, because we know that when unemployment is very high for a very long time, people become discouraged, they walk away from the labor market, and they never come back. They never come back. And so their whole lives, their whole working lives, and their whole earning potential across their whole working life is damaged by depressions. That's why they're so much worse than regular recessions, because you don't bounce out of them quickly. They also can, in the worst case scenario, they can drive inflation down below zero. And when inflation is below zero, remember that means that the real value of everyone's debts rises. So you're running to stand still on your debt repayment. So your debt repayments end up taking a bigger and bigger share of your income, because your income is falling, not just growing slowly, it's falling. So this is why central banks are so scared of depressions, because they're really hard to get out of. I mean, Japan's been in a depression for decades now. And it is so important that we don't allow sustained deflationary psychology to develop. It's so important that we try and get unemployment back down as quickly as we possibly can, so that we don't have people who become detached from the labor market and never come back in. I mean, this is, it's a disaster. Again, think of it in terms of like this year's graduates. I mean, who wants to be graduating college this summer? We need to get the economy moving as quickly as possible, so that this year's graduates don't run into next year's graduates and the year after's graduates, and you end up with this huge pileup of super qualified young people, enthusiastic, wanting to get into the workforce, but they just can't. That's what happens in depressions. So right now, I don't think we're going to be in a depression, because I believe there'll be a vaccine by the end of the year. Right. But I've got to say it's very contingent on that. If it takes 3 years to get a vaccine, then we will be in a depression. And although policy can do a lot to limit the depth of the depression, really, we cannot get a full recovery until we can stop social distancing. It's as simple as that, because so much of our economy is discretionary services where people are next to other people. And until we can get back to that, until we have a vaccine, then I'm afraid the risk of a depression is still going to hang over us. But I'm an optimist, and I think that we will be able to avoid it, but I can't promise.
Thank you for that, Ian. Actually, we are going to look at, we are going to ask you about a few more things in building confidence among the consumers and the workforce. So we'll come back to that. Ian, something very important. You mentioned about negative inflation. Before going into that, so price of commodities and income are two of the most tangible economic indicators that we always feel as lay people.
Yeah.
So where do you think the cost of living is headed right now?
Right now, it has been under very intense downward pressure. The first thing that happened was that we had the biggest ever drop in US consumer prices in the spring, the biggest ever drop. And that was for a couple of very specific reasons. First of all, airline fares collapsed because people stopped flying overnight. And it's not a big component of the consumer price index, but it's there. The second thing was that in tandem with the drop in airline travel, hotels suddenly emptied. And again, they're not a big component of the CPI, but they are in it. And so occupancy rates went from 70% to 20% overnight. And so room rates collapsed. And the third thing that happened was that a large bunch of retailers, clothing retailers, department stores. Remember, this is early spring, March, so we're coming out of the winter. All the stores are full of the spring clothing ranges, and suddenly all their customers disappear. So they have to start getting rid of inventory as fast as they possibly can. So we saw enormous declines in prices for clothing. So clothing, airline fares, hotels, they did all the damage. It's pretty much done now. It's pretty much done. So now we're in a period instead, we're not looking at specific sectors. Now we're looking at the big picture. And the big picture really is a question of wages. Because for most companies, the biggest single cost is labor. It's for a typical US business, labor is 70–75% of all the costs. So yeah, commodities are important, especially for manufacturers, very important. But most of the US CPI, and in fact this is true in all developed economies, consumer price indexes are dominated by services, and services are dominated by wages. Now what happens to wages when the unemployment rate shoots from 3% or 3.5%, where it was in February, to 13.5%, where it is today? Well, what happens is that wage pressure goes to the downside. So this is where the threat of negative inflation comes from, is that we've got so many unemployed people that wages collapse. And if wages collapse, that gets passed through into the CPI. Now, this is not happening yet, but the danger is that it could happen if we allow the unemployment rate to remain too high for too long. Again, you know, this is the classic lesson of depressions, is that you must avoid falling wages, because you develop this spiral where wages and prices fall together. And the experience of countries that suffered this is that it is the devil's own job to get out of it. So this is why the Fed is doing everything it possibly can, and why the federal government ultimately has to do more as well, because we have to prevent the labor market becoming so slack that people will work for buttons, you know, because that is actually a disaster. It's paradoxical, because as an employer, you think, great, you know, I'm getting my labor cheaper, but actually for the economy as a whole, that's the worst possible thing, the worst.
Right. Ian,
I'd just like to add one thing to that from a perspective that we see at the bank. And I do agree with Ian that it's important to maintain wages and wage growth, because it creates a vicious cycle. The one countervailing event that I do see, which could end up helping employment to some degree, at least at the margins, but raising costs, is we've noticed that a number of clients who had supply chains, particularly from China, have immediately had to regroup and create alternative supplies. In some cases, literally retrofitting or rebuilding or doing other things to manufacture component materials here. So that when you read that something's made in the USA, sometimes a lot of it is made in China or in Taiwan or in other places. One example is, you know, for example, ibuprofen. About 80 ibuprofen, Advil, you know, and it's marketed under a number of names. We were importing about 80% for many companies of the components that were utilized to make Advil, even though the Advil itself was being made, you know, here or in Connecticut. And so that's something that we're not just seeing in the pharmaceutical area, we're seeing across the range. And the other issue which I think is being superimposed on this is what's going on with the current trade tensions between the United States and China, which is that particularly what's in the news is 5G, but other types of chips, chip needs, not just for 5G, are being questioned on a national security basis here. I know that's happening actually in the UK to some degree as well, with this government, which I think is a valid concern. It's sort of, again, is outside of pure economic perspective. But I think for better, for worse, I think we've already passed peak globalization, which means that as countries start producing more internally, they're going to do so less efficiently. If we had a purely efficient world trade scheme where everyone trusted each other, prices would continue to decline for raw materials and like. But we are going to see that, and we are going to see people brought into the manufacturing sector who actually may not want to have been in the manufacturing sector, but that's where the jobs are going to be.
We have a question on that for you later. So let me stop you there, and I'm going to head back to Ian and come back to you on that. Would that be all right with you?
That was it.
Thank you. Now, about the stimulus packages and the sustainability, I would like to ask Ian, how sustainable is it for us to keep doing this as a federal government or the Fed? And what do you think the worst case scenario or the worst case scenarios regarding these packages? Because how long, I mean, let's say if the vaccine does not come into the forum by Christmas, how long do you think a government can sustain doing this?
Well, this is a question to which there isn't a definitive answer, because in terms of the US, the US is in a unique position because the US is the provider of the dollars, which is the world's reserve currency. So I think, could we? I've got someone coming over on the audio there. So the US is in a different position pretty much to everybody else. The US gets to cheat, if you like, because the US creates dollars, which is the world's reserve currency. So does that mean that the US can just run 20% of GDP budget deficits forever? Well, no. Ultimately, it can't, because of the cost of servicing it, which right now is extremely low, but it probably wouldn't be in the event that we're running 20% of GDP budget deficits indefinitely. But at a minimum, I think we can afford to do this without too much trouble for a couple of years. That would raise the public debt ratio by about 40 percentage points, which would be very roughly equivalent to the increase in the final years of the Second World War. It would leave the level of debt higher, but the financing cost is a lot lower. So remember, what is the burden of debt? The burden of debt is not the debt itself. It is the cost of funding it. Nobody stopped any economic activity because they had a debt. They stopped their economic activity, or they curtailed their economic activity because they couldn't afford to service the debt, or they had to devote too much of their resources to servicing the debt so that they couldn't do anything else. Mm-hmm. The US is a million miles from this, a million miles. It's a very different story if you're sitting in an emerging market where first of all, your currency is not the dollar, where you're relying on foreigners to fund you, and where there isn't trust and there isn't credibility and there isn't history. But the thing is that everybody knows that if they buy $1 of treasury debt, whatever the interest rate is, high, low, or medium, they're going to get the interest. Now, the inflation rate will determine what that interest is worth, but they will get it. They will get it. Whereas if you're, lending dollars to Brazil or Argentina, there's actually a non-zero chance that you won't get it. And we've seen this over and over again.
Right.
So, the US, Europe, Japan, Canada, Australasia, developed economies, they do get to do things that is much more difficult for emerging markets. And so that's yet another reason why the incidence of COVID, I think, ultimately will be much worse in emerging economies than it is in the developed economies of the West. And obviously, the emerging economies, have much weaker healthcare systems and all the rest of it. They tend to have younger populations, which is good, but they do tend to have less well-funded healthcare systems. So anyway, but I think that strictly from the US perspective, I am not worried about sustainability of financing, provided we're not talking about another 5 years.
I see.
For me, if we're talking about 5 years, that means that none of these current vaccines under testing work, not one of them, and that just seems implausible to me. I mean, I'm not a medical person, but from what I've read about COVID, it isn't actually a very complicated virus. So we ought to be able to beat it with 100 candidates.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm a physician, so I actually agree with you on that one, because I see that a vaccine should work pretty soon, and I'm hopeful myself. Scott, I need to ask you a question at this point. The interest rate is bank's income. How a bank like yours could operate when the interest rate is zero?
Good question. So first of all, margins for banks will decline somewhat. There's no question. But everyone can't borrow at government costs. So the government interest rate may be 0. LIBOR is at, I don't know, today 8, 9, or tomorrow 8, 9 basis points. But other borrowing costs are not quite as low. Having said that, the banking profitability will be impacted to some degree. But on the other hand, I have to tell you, the flip side is that income for a bank is not only the amount of money, is not only our net interest margin, but it's also the volume. And we publicly announced at Signature, we haven't announced our results yet for this quarter, but we've already publicly announced that our deposit base has grown by over $5 billion this quarter as people have sought safety. So most of that money, we do keep it earning very low amounts, but it's more than a 0 amount. And right. I would just say one thing that does concern me is the concept of negative interest rates, because banking systems in countries that have negative interest rates do tend to lose their incentive to lend. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense to be lending to someone and get less money back. And so that ends up having an extraordinarily corrosive impact on the economy. And maybe one, but very few economies that have gotten into negative interest rates have been able to really get out of negative interest rates without driving themselves into long periods of subpar performance.
Scott, I need to ask you a follow-up question on that. As a banker, how do you ensure depositor safety and investor confidence in a situation like this, and equity returns for your deposits?
Well, that's the number one. When we started the 2008 crisis, the reason we were the only bank that we were, I think, one of the few banks that actually grew deposits in the fourth quarter of 2008. And that was really the time for us to shine, was because I have one adage, axiom, principle, whatever you want to call it, for banking, which is that if you're a banker, know you're not a genius, just avoid doing anything stupid. And that means being safe and sound. So as starting in late February, as soon as the COVID pandemic started to potentially be an issue. We didn't know it was an issue then, and we certainly hoped it would be. We raised and kept extremely liquid at the Federal Reserve. So we literally, and I can't disclose these numbers now because we're going to announce results in late July, but we've kept an unprecedented amount of money for us sitting literally in cash. Wow. And the flip side is that we also believe our balance sheet has to be one where we don't take untoward risks. So we don't do construction lending. We never did subprime lending. We never did CDOs. We never did all of what I called the genius stuff because we recognized there was risk to it. So our balance sheet is boring, and that's okay. That means we're going to earn less. But on the other hand, I can sleep at night.
So
that's the key.
Well, I totally agree with you on that one. So I need to ask you a question at this point. So you were a banker when we had this crisis in 2008.
Yes.
You are a banker now.
Yes.
But the important question is, the people who are likely to lose jobs are the very people you give mortgages to.
So first of all, we have next to no single family mortgages. I mean, that's not our business. We're a $50+ billion bank, and we have less than $200 million in single family mortgages. So we try to do what we do best and focus on that. Now, having said that, we do lend money to apartment complexes and multifamily. And by and large, the collection rates, while some people are having issues, by and large, the collection rates have been pretty good on multifamily. That's why I say we don't do anything too risky. And to the extent that we do anything with mortgages, we would just, want it to be covered by Fannie or Freddie.
Right. That is limiting exposure. That is really fantastic. So I'm going to come into rentability of properties a little later, but I would like to ask Ian about banks who lend to people who are likely to lose jobs as mortgages, single-family mortgages. What is their fate? What can they do? Because housing market depends on these middle-income families who take mortgages. So, but we see a good picture where we see a rising demand for housing. But do you think that's going to stay on?
Well, as I said earlier, most people who buy homes are much older than the people who've lost jobs so far. You know, the first wave of job losses is in leisure, hospitality, retail, where the median age is 30-ish, and so mostly, to put it very crudely, the people who lost jobs in the first wave were renters, young renters essentially, rather than home buyers. What worries me is two things. Firstly, that the second wave of job losses could go deeper. You know, it could, and with some evidence of this now, that it's kind of moving into management and moving into supply chain. So getting away from those young people, frontline customer service workers. That's the first thing that makes me nervous. And the second thing that makes me nervous is the possibility that that the federal government doesn't continue to offer sufficient support to people to keep paying their mortgages. You know, again, under normal circumstances, the process of creative destruction, if you like, requires that some businesses fail. It requires that some people lose their jobs, because that is how the economy finds the winners and puts resources into the winners, and that's how it grows in the medium term. But what we have now is not a process of creative destruction. We just have destruction. That's what the virus has done. And that's why it's so important that the federal government uses its resources, or rather uses its ability to raise money, either in markets or from the Fed or both, uses that ability to support people until such time as we can revert to a more normal economy. In a normal economy, at any given point, there are people losing their jobs, there are people gaining their jobs. There are new businesses being founded, there are older businesses failing. And that's an ongoing process, and that happens all the time. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how we get better and smarter, is by trying things that don't always work.
Right.
But what we have now is an order of magnitude different from that, both in terms of scale and potentially in terms of duration if we don't get a vaccine. And so this is why the federal government is doing what it wouldn't normally do, and this is why we've had enhanced unemployment benefits, which I believe will be extended. It's why we've made unemployment benefits available to people who previously wouldn't qualify for them, like gig workers and freelancers. This is all because what's happening now is not an economic cycle event. It is a straightforward external shock. And the policy response to an external shock has to be different. It has to be more aggressive. And, one of the consequences of this is that the federal government does things which in some ways look like, protecting the banks. But actually, we have to protect the banks because the banks are the heart of the financial system. Now, you can protect the banks directly by bailing them out, or you can protect them by supporting their borrowers. Right. So if you support people who've got mortgages to pay, or support people who've got rent to pay, so that the landlords can make the payment on their debt to the bank, then everybody wins. The cost ultimately falls on the federal government. But as I said earlier, think of the alternative. The alternative is so much worse. The alternative is that we just allow the chips to fall where they may, and where they fall is just sustained destruction, which is in nobody's interest. So it's hugely important that politicians kind of get over this hurdle of being accused of bailing out people who are reckless, or bailing out banks. All this language is very unhelpful. What we're actually doing is keeping enough oil in the engine to keep it turning over, so that we can then run it again properly when the circumstances allow us. The fatal mistake that you can make in a circumstance like this is to allow the oil to drain out of the engine then seizes up, and then how the hell do you restart it? You can't. So this is what the federal government has to do. It's got to keep putting oil in. And touch wood, I think they'll do what they need to do.
I think you answered 3 more questions that I had later, which is fantastic. Thank you. Ian, there's a question I would like to draw your attention to. A lot of Americans get their insurance from their employment. Now, health insurance from their employment. So people who are likely to lose jobs who are in the middle income bracket are likely to be the persons who used to get their insurance from their employers. If they don't fall below the Medicaid threshold, they probably will have no access to insurance.
Yeah.
What are the options? Because we have a lot of viewers who might be in this position or who might know people in this position. What can you tell them, or where is health insurance available for them?
Well, it isn't. I mean, you've just described their situation that if you don't qualify for Medicaid and you've lost your jobs, well, you potentially become uninsured. So the number of uninsured people is going to rise. No question about that. And then, of course, well, we have to address the question of a potential change of administration in November, because if President Trump is re-elected, then there's a much greater chance that Obamacare will be fully dismantled, which would mean another 15 million people uninsured. But of course, if Biden is elected president, which is my expectation, and the Democrats take the Senate, which is also my expectation, then I think there's quite a good chance that Obamacare would be extended and expanded and reinforced. But of course, a Biden administration wouldn't take office until January, and here we are now, it's still June. So it's still, there is potentially, that's quite a long period. I mean, and for people who are sick, 7 months without health insurance can feel like a very long time.
That's
so
true.
I'm really nervous about this. I mean, it's a real weakness, it's a structural weakness of the US that healthcare is so contingent on employment. Though again, I would also say that, I mean, we don't really have hard data on this, but again, if you think about the sort of people who lost their jobs in the first wave, a lot of part-time workers, a lot of casual workers, a lot of bar workers, young people who weren't getting their healthcare through their employment position. Losing 25 million jobs from bars and restaurants and retail is not the same as losing 25 million jobs in middle management, where you can safely assume that everybody in those positions was getting their healthcare from their employer. So the loss of health insurance per job lost is not one-to-one, but it's still potentially quite high. Ultimately, I'm hoping that the next fiscal rescue package will provide some sort of fix for these people so that they don't fall into a void while we're waiting for the return of their jobs, which again is contingent, I've said this 1,000 times, is contingent on a vaccine. But the federal government has the power to do something creative, federally extend, raise the Medicaid or threshold, for 6 months or whatever. There's a lot of things that they could do, but it requires agreement between the House and the Senate. The Senate's initial response to the Democrat bill 6 weeks ago was to say, we don't want to do anything. That position has changed because, of course, 6 weeks ago, we didn't have the second wave in the South and the West, which is mostly red states. But now we do have that wave. And so the Republicans have now recognized that they'll have to do something. Whether they'll do enough or whether they'll do what I want them to do, that's another question. But we will get another bill, and I'm hoping that there will be healthcare support in there in some form. But at this point, I just don't know for sure.
Wow, that's a fantastic answer, Ian. Thank you very much for that. Scott, I would like to ask you something quite personal to you, but I think our viewers will appreciate your insight. Resilience is probably something you've known and you've practiced all your life. Your whole life story is a shining example of how to be resilient and strong at times of hardships. Tell our viewers how to motivate themselves to be resilient, and please use your own example, your own life as an example. We would like to hear that.
Well, thank you for that. I talk a little bit about this in my book, In Good Faith, which is probably where you're getting this from.
Yes, exactly.
I grew up the son of a Holocaust survivor. So my father, when he was not yet 14, was rounded up by the Nazis, and his father was murdered, his brothers were murdered, his aunts, his uncles, his cousins. His mother had already died in childbirth, so she wasn't murdered then, but she was already had died. And frankly, because of all that, my closest relative on earth is a second cousin once removed, who just happened to be away working on a kibbutz in then Palestine. So I grew up realizing my father, well, let me just say this. My father then was deported to be slave labor at the Hadekrug, at the Svetlan Hadekrug work camp. Then he was sent to Auschwitz, where he was taken out of Auschwitz to be brought to Warsaw to clean up after the uprising. And then he was sent to Dachau. And when he was liberated, he was less than 70 pounds. and it took him a year to recover. And he made it to the United States, to Chicago, where he was able to have a son, and was able to get married and have a son in that order. And he always taught me, first of all, don't ever look at yourself as a victim. That if he would know, and this was, he never read Viktor Frankl, but it was uncannily similar. He said, look, there were people in the concentration camps who thought they would get liberated next week, next month, next, something. And they were sure it was going to happen soon. And they ended up dying because it didn't happen very soon. And then there were others who thought ultimately there will be redemption. Ultimately things are going to get together. But in the meantime, I need to put one foot in front of the other. I need to get through this day. I need to figure out the best way to get through this day. And those are the people that survived. Those are the people that made it through. And he would say, you can never look at yourself as a victim. Because if you look at yourself and question, why did this happen to me? And live in that sort of pool of regret or blame, but what am I going to do with what's happened to me? Where am I going to go from here? It changes your entire mindset. And that's something that I have lived with. I mean, I grew up, we grew up in very modest circumstances. And I lived in the dining room. My parents had a one-bedroom apartment. I grew up in very modest circumstances. But there was always, what's happening today, okay, this is what's happening. We're going to get through it, one step in front of the other, not a problem. What are we going to do from here? How are we going to make this planet a little better place? How are we going to make our lives a little better? And always looking toward that. And that's just a very deep mindset that, thank God, my father instilled in me.
Thank you so much, Scott. I hope all the youngsters and startup business owners who are listening to that took notes and followed that advice so closely. Ian, I would like to go into a few other questions, and we have a million other questions, and we are getting hundreds of questions, but I wish we had the whole day, but we don't. From healthcare and resilience, I would like to ask you a few questions regarding education. Do you think in-person education is going to be a reality if there's no vaccine at all?
Well, without a vaccine, unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult because, lecture theatres and seminar rooms, indoor venues where people sit next to each other are classic COVID vectors. So without a vaccine, it's going to be really difficult. And I know that some universities have already, cancelled 4 classes, in anticipation, which I think is the right decision. The thing is, ultimately, I think that there are enormous benefits for students being physically together in a campus setting because of the interchange of ideas and the interchange of cultures where people from all over the world or all over the country get to meet. And you cannot replicate that experience in an online environment. So I very much hope that what we're seeing now is kind of an aberration. I mean, speaking personally, I hope I never use Zoom again. When the COVID is over, because I see huge value in meeting in person, and when you have a meeting in person in a room of people, you pick up nonverbal cues. You can see when someone isn't quite with you or is disagreeing but isn't saying so, and it's a much richer environment for everybody to be in person. So I am not a massive proponent of the online education model, and right now, of course, we have no choice. And is it better than not being educated? Obviously. But is it better than what we had before? I'm much less convinced about that, and so I'm really hoping that we can return to the the old model, which I think ultimately is a much richer experience for everybody.
I totally attest to that because I'm completing my PhD and I teach classes. And when I taught classes in person, I enjoyed it. The students enjoyed it, and teaching it online is quite a beast, honestly.
Yeah.
Ian and Scott, I need to make a request to both of you at this point. We are getting so many questions from our viewers. And would you be able to extend our stay for another 15 minutes, if you don't mind?
I'm good, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. You're so kind, and we are ever so thankful because we are learning so much. And we are unlikely to have both of you in the same room with us like this for a while. So let us make the best use of it. Scott, you are the ultimate expert in this, and I need to ask you. You have spoken multiple times about cashless world. Do you think COVID-19 pandemic is the tipping point that will push the world into a cashless situation?
Well, I've been talking about a cashless society and writing on it since about 2012. And if you Google my name in cashless society, you'll actually get several Google pages on it.
Yes.
So it's something I have been thinking about. I do think that this will accelerate the move toward non-currency, in other words, non-cash tangible payments. Having said that, like so many things that COVID is encouraging, like we were just talking about online education, I'm not sure that it's totally a good thing, because cashless transfers, and were we to go entirely cashless, also has a big impact on civil liberty, privacy, and the like. So a few years back, our mayor here in New York, Mayor Bloomberg, decided that it was bad for people to buy soft drinks that were filled with sugar. So he did get a law passed to ban sugary drinks that were greater than 16 ounces. You couldn't buy it, but it got overturned. But let's say that we had a cashless society and someone from the government said, you know what, your glucose level is a little high. We don't really think you should be drinking these sugary drinks. Well, they could make it so that I could never use my payment mechanism to ever buy anything with a sugary drink. And that's not so far afield, because several years back as a bank, we were forbidden from allowing payments to certain online gambling, to a couple of various areas where your credit card could not work. Wow. If you wanted to engage in online gambling and other nefarious sorts of uses of payments, or deemed by the government. So moving all of our payments to being cashless does have a real privacy and civil liberty risk. Having said that, I think we are going to catapult the United States toward that. The United States was way behind Sweden and other countries, but now I think we are going to not entirely catch up, but I think we're going to narrow the gap. And we at Signature are working on that too. I have to tell you, we have to be prepared for the market, even if I think that it's not necessarily the best thing for society.
So you're alluding to my next question anyway. That means, so your role as a banker is changing because of cashless situation, is it?
Well, it is. So we're, as you may or may not know, 85% of our clients are owners of private businesses, and the other 15% are affluent retail. So we're very involved in payment systems, primarily for small and medium-sized businesses. And so we started this thing, which you may have heard of, you can also Google it, called Signet. Mm-hmm. We're the first bank in the United States of America. We're the only bank right now that's FDIC insured and that uses a money transfer system that is built on the blockchain, so that everything is recorded. Now, it's a private blockchain, and it's only among clients who are vetted between, by signature. So it's not something that, anybody can just log in and utilize. But it's a stable coin blockchain, and we have people today. It's Sunday. transferring money between Tokyo, Timbuktu, Tel Aviv, and Toronto with instantaneous, actually it's between, depending on where it is in the blockchain refreshment, 5 to 30 seconds. And the money is transferring today.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen during this COVID crisis, as people have had, more difficulties accessing wire transfer and other items, or been concerned about security, that actually people have been really adopting this in also in much better numbers.
Mm-hmm.
That have been gratifying, but that wouldn't have happened without COVID. So we have to be mindful of things that we can do that, will serve us currently. Now, post-COVID, I think Signet's going to take off even further, because I think people are saying, wait, I don't have to wait for wire transfer. I can get instantaneous money. I don't even have to deal with the Fed. There's no waiting for a Fed wire. I just literally see the money transfer on screen. So, and I'll just end with this: people using small amounts, as little as, in the few $1,000s, that are transferring goods and services in a contactless way between small businesses, are using Signet. Again, who'd have thunk it?
Right. So now, Ian, in his presentation, and you yourself in your last answer, were talking about stability. Now, I would like to ask both of you, the stability of US dollar is very important in this world order. Ian, what do you think is going to happen to the stability of US dollar? Do you think the Fed will do something to maintain its stability?
Well, strictly speaking, dollar policy is the remit of the Treasury. But dollar policy for the last 30 years essentially has just consisted of the Treasury Secretary, whoever it is, saying a strong dollar is good for America. I mean, and that's it. So that there hasn't been, an activist currency policy of the sort of 70s, 80s, the Plaza Accord and the Louvre Accords and those sort of international things. I mean, currency stability, is obviously desirable in and of itself. In a world where, again, vaccine contingent, the US economy can return to something that's recognizably normal by, the middle of next year, I don't see a long-term threat to the dollar.
I see.
Right now, short term, I can think of reasons why I might want to be, moving out of dollar assets and maybe into some European assets, simply on the grounds that the economic reopening in Europe is proceeding much more smoothly than it is in the US, and just for portfolio balance reasons, I might think it would be appropriate. But we're not seeing that at a sort of a global level. We're not seeing a massive dollar retreat. The market doesn't like bad news on COVID, and on days when the news is bad, and of course there's been a lot of bad news over the last couple of weeks, the dollar tends to be a bit weaker. But if you're going to sell dollars, you need to buy something else. And yeah, at the margin, you might think that European assets have some merit, but fundamentally, a large-scale move out of dollars during a global pandemic strikes me as being pretty unlikely, because ultimately the dollar is the global store of value, and at a time of pandemic and uncertainty, ultimately that's where people want to hold assets. And gold, of course, as well, when the gold price is at an 8-year high. But I don't, again, everything is different in a world with no vaccine and everything, wrecked forever. Then I don't know what happens. But if you regard, this year as being like a one-time thing, and next year being very different, and a restoration of normalcy in the economy, then there's no reason to be, a fundamental dollar bear.
Right. So with that, I would like to move on to a couple of areas before I actually open the floor to questions. Production and manufacturing are fundamental in economic recovery. Now, we see a move to move manufacturing out of China. Ian, do you think these factories are going to come back to USA in large numbers to create enough jobs?
Well, not to create enough jobs to replace the ones that have been lost in the last few months, that's for sure. Manufacturing is only about 9%, 8.5% of payrolls now, so it's a pretty small sector. Back in the 60s, it was a third of payrolls. So it shrunk a lot. But I very much hear what Scott said earlier about the return of some manufacturing to the US. Supply chains have been disrupted, and of course businesses are now wondering about the future of China trade policy, and whether it might be politically, the end of the long-term shift into China. Plus, of course, China is a lot more expensive than it used to be as a place to manufacture. So the question is, are all these jobs going to come back from China to the US? And the answer to that is no. But some of them will, at the margin. What I think is more likely is that businesses that want to plan for resilience will need to have more than one supplier. So what happened was China effectively became the supplier of everything for everybody. And we've learned now that being reliant on a single supplier is difficult and risky, and partly because of the pandemic and partly because of trade policy. So, what I think we'll end up with is companies probably having more complicated supply chains where they have some supply from China, but they also supply from Indonesia and Bangladesh and India and Mexico and Brazil. And, because you need to have alternatives. I mean, that's the lesson of the last 6 months. Well, actually the last 2 years, really, if you go back to the start of the trade war, the lesson is that you need to have maybe more options than you previously would have wanted. And that, of course, again, to echo Scott's point, that's expensive. It costs more. Resilience and alternatives cost more than single supply chains, but of course they do mean that you can sleep at night, because you know that if it goes wrong in China, then you can always rely on your supplier in Vietnam. But that sort of thing can't happen overnight. China's infrastructure is enormous, and replicating that in other countries is not something that can happen very quickly. So the idea that we're going to move away from China en masse, no, that's too much of a stretch. But yes, at the margin, absolutely.
Wow, thank you for that answer, and that makes it so much clearer for us. So in the process of recovery, food security is very, very important. Scott, as a banker, what do you see as your role in creating food security to the economy?
Creating security?
Yes.
So I think our role is to be a fortress for people's money, in all candor, where they don't have to worry about their liquidity. And that's why when we were talking a little, I didn't make this point before, but when we were talking about, I did to some degree, when we were talking about bank profitability, I don't think our role is to maximize profit. I think our role is to provide a safe place for folks to deposit, and then they're going to deposit more money with us, and then we may make a lower spread, but we'll have a larger balance sheet. I still remember, I still remember I was at Signature Bank. I had investors come in during 05, 06 saying, why aren't you buying any of these AAA subprime securities? They're great. They're paying so much more than the Fannie and Ginnie, the Ginnie Maes and the treasuries that you guys hold. They're AAA. And I said no. And they would, and clients said, well, why aren't you doing construction lending? The spreads are great there. And we said no. And CDOs, we said no. And I think in 2020 hindsight, obviously we made the right decision. But what we did know is that, okay, we're going to make less money. We're never going to be able to make an ROE as high as others, a return on equity as high as others. But we can be, we can feel safe and secure, because when I look at clients, I want to let them know that they don't have to worry. I mean, most of our deposits are above the insured limit, because they're small and medium-sized businesses, and they're people with substantial dollars. And we need to have a fortress balance sheet. And frankly, there's a lot of talk in Washington about the appropriate place of the banking sector, the non-banking sector, and I don't want to take us off there, but I think it's appropriate for the banking sector to be a little more modest when it comes to taking risk, and recognize that if ever banks go down, that just squashes the money supply and it makes people fearful. And so we do have a special place in the economy.
Right. So with that, I would like to ask Ian, food security depends on farming. And farming is quite dependent on immigrant labor. Now we have a push back towards not having much immigrant labor. What is the future of farming industry with regards to food security when this is the reality?
Yes. Well, it makes no sense at all. So it's not sustainable as a policy. You know, it's a dog whistle to Trump's nativist supporters, but it's not sustainable. So I mean, again, you know, I'm expecting a different administration as of next January, and you know, I'm expecting a significant shift back in immigration policy. You know, Trump's cancelling of the H-1B visas last week is just inexplicable, shall we say. Anyway, so short-term difficulties. I mean, we have a similar thing in the UK. You know, since we left the EU, that we've now got crops literally rotting in the fields because the immigrant labour that used to come and pick them from Eastern Europe isn't here. So this is very self-defeating, very self-defeating, and it's just the same in the US. So you know, it's an example of completely inappropriate policy, which is not sustainable. But during the period where it's being implemented, it's very counterproductive. You know, but this is a continuation of the damage that trade policy has done to farming as well. You know, which has killed, 20% of all the dairy farms in Wisconsin. So it doesn't make any sense, but it's been done through a political lens rather than an economic lens. So it requires, therefore, a political shift to change it. But however you look at it, from an economic perspective, it doesn't make any sense to deny businesses the labor supply that they can't source at home.
And Ian, with that, I would like, because of the time limitations we are facing, I would like to ask you the $1 million question that people probably ask you every other hour. Where to invest right now in the near future, and where to invest in the medium term?
Yes. Well, I'm not an investment advisor. I'm a macroeconomist, but what I would say is that I wouldn't want to be short of equities on the day that a successful vaccine is announced, because that will be a very good day for markets. But I think there are, that's not going to happen until September at the earliest. And between now and then, we could get some very bad days. I don't think we'll return to the chaos of February and March. But I think all investors, have to be prepared for significant volatility, because the uncertainty, which was significant, is now severe. So I'm nervous about that. Looking beyond that into the post-vaccine world, I'm pretty optimistic. The Fed will not be reversing its support for the economy very quickly. They've been extremely clear that they will be as supportive as they can be for as long as necessary. And they will not prematurely pull back on their support. I don't think the federal government will do that either, because the new administration, if it's a Biden administration, will be looking immediately ahead to the midterms in 2022, when they'll be hoping to take a bigger majority in the Senate. So I don't think they will be crazy enough to withdraw the fiscal support either. So my guess is that actually a successful implementation of a vaccine would be good for the real economy and good for the markets as well. It wouldn't result in an immediate tightening. But I'm very cognizant of risk between now and then, because markets had got themselves into a nice groove where there was a very strong narrative, and the narrative in markets was COVID's getting under control, the federal government's going to do some more, the Fed is printing loads and loads of money, so you've got to be long. And that trade worked brilliantly for 3 months. And now it's come under attack from the shift in the COVID story. And that really is a huge element of uncertainty that I think we were not expecting to have.
So that actually pretty much ends our time. But Scott, do you have any final remarks for us before we propose the vote of thanks?
No, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank everyone. It's always a pleasure to chat, even via Zoom, with Ian. And it's a pleasure to chat with all of you. I really do hope to be out to California as soon as we have vaccines and the like that make it okay to get on planes. And I'd love, as there's no real replacement for shaking hands and for meeting people in person. And I look forward to meeting many of you at some event out on the West Coast sometime in the not so distant future.
That desire is mutual. And let me please take this opportunity to thank yourself and Signature Bank for your kind support for this event. And Ian, do you have any final remarks before we hand it over to Nalin?
Stay safe. Keep out of crowded bars.
Thank you. I was about to say that myself. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us for 2 more minutes. Nalin Kulasuriya, one of my high school buddies from Sri Lanka, is going to post the vote of thanks and end the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shyam. First and foremost, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Ian Shepherdson and Mr. Scott Shea for making your kind self available for us. This is indeed a great honor for all of us. You answered all our questions so eloquently and with exceptional clarity. Your kind gesture of sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience will be remembered by all of us. By the way, we warmly welcome Signature Bank to Southern California. I also take this opportunity to thank Dr. Shyama Makalanda, my high school buddy, for moderating and facilitating the session. Your questions were timely and important. Your dedication, enthusiasm, hard work, and resilience are well appreciated. Our sincere gratitude to the Oregon State University team who supported Dr. Shyam, led by Professor Jeff Luck, Ms. Almudena Campesano, Mr. Kurt Hagen, Ms. Michaela Guthrie, and Ms. Celia Grace. Thank you for being an amazing team for moderation. A special shout out to the COVID-19 organizing committee of Ananda College All Boys Association for organizing a number of tremendously successful events. Courtesy demands that I mention the dedication and commitment of our own Colonel Vakiraj Singha for his endless support and advice for our work, alongside the leadership and direction of President Rakshita Dissanayake and the Secretary Rahim Mantar of Anand College All Boys Association, West Coast. We cannot forget the Board of Directors, Executive Committee, members, and families of Anand College All Boys Association, West Coast, who are always there to support us. Also, I must mention my dear friend Joe Moriello of Signature Bank, who coordinated our efforts with the Signature Bank. He was instrumental in facilitating Scott's and Ian's presence here today. Our wholehearted, sincere thanks to Signature Bank for their kind support by sponsoring this event. Without you, we would not be able to make this event. We hope that our efforts to educate the community at a time of such uncertainty was a success. As you all know by now, this event is organized by the Ananda College All Boys Association of West Coast in collaboration with the Acobawc-East Coast and other Sri Lankan past people's organizations active in the USA and elsewhere, alongside with the other community organizations. Today's forum is the last of 2 phases. During the first phase, we extensively talk about the health impact of this pandemic. We hope that this discourse will leave something for you for the present and will leave you with a glimpse into the future of how to navigate through these difficult times. Our collective associations do not hesitate to support fellow alumni associations and the community whenever possible. It is our humble belief that we must all work together in one direction to survive this crisis, regardless of our core values, cultures, race, or politics. We have launched many community programs during this difficult time, so we humbly invite you to participate in future programs as well. Finally, on behalf of Ananda College All Boys Association, I would like to express my gratitude to everyone who participated today. Please be mindful and careful as we are on a turbulent journey due to this pandemic. May you all have the strength and blessing you need to get through this uncertain time very quickly. Let us hope we will return to normal soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Good show. Thanks. Thank you, Marky.
Let's wait for everybody and we'll just stay for a little while.